The folklore in Kid Cryptid wouldn't exist if it weren't for the rich history and vibrant cultures these stories come from. While we do our best to provide accurate information, we recognize that we are, at best, amateurs here. This podcast is best considered for entertainment purposes only, and it comes from a place of love and respect for the peoples behind the lore. Now, on with the show.
I'm Sean.
I'm Elias.
And you are listening to Kid Cryptid, the podcast where we discuss the stories and folklore surrounding the shy and sometimes cranky creatures known as cryptids. How's it going, Elias?
Pretty good.
We're going to do things a little differently today. You know why?
Why?
Because we've got supporters on Patreon. Yeah, so big shout out to Brooks and Amelia for the love. It really does mean a lot to know that you're enjoying the show, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much as well.
All right, so you ready to get down to the business at hand?
Yep.
I didn't really give you a lot of clues in the opening there, so with that in mind, do you just want to take a shot in the dark about what we're going to talk about today?
Ghosts.
Depending on which kind of legend you want to look at here, that's not too far off, so good guess. Let's just keep going. So this creature has us going underground. Today we're going to talk about knockers.
Knockers? Like, do they go like this?
So, I mean, you'll find out, but the name and what they do is pretty much, it's not a very inventive name.
Okay. So do they knock on doors or do they...
Do they what?
I don't know. What do they do?
Well, I guess you'll have to wait and find out, huh? I was going to ask you what you thought they did, but you pretty well nailed that on the head, so we'll just keep going. So first I want to point out that knockers are especially interesting because they clearly show how stories can travel and evolve as people move around the globe. Originating in Celtic lore, they're most commonly associated with the tin mines of Cornwall. Now, tin has been mined in Cornwall since at least 2500 BC, so that's back when the Romans were in Britain. Now, do you know where Cornwall is?
Mm-mm.
So Cornwall is in England. It's kind of in the southwest. It's very rocky. I haven't been there, so I don't want to talk too much about it, but it's they're very much known for their tin mining.
Oh.
Tin mining has been going on in Cornwall since about 2500 BC. So at that time, the Romans had actually invaded Britain and were in England. And that's a really, really, really long time ago.
So what, did the Romans have a war against the Britain, and then when they won the war, they came over to England?
To not get too detailed into things, yes. They took over England through war, and they incorporated the British into the Roman Empire. That's all we need to know about that part. Now, at that point in time, tin was a highly sought-after material for trade. And the Cornish, so that's what people from Cornwall are called. They're called Cornish. They earned a reputation as some of the finest miners around. They knew how to dig through the earth and harvest its riches, but they also knew of its dangers. See, down in the stifling dark, the miners are always on edge as a cave-in could happen at any time. Over the noise of picking away at rock, they'd listen for telltale creaks of beams about to give. As they listened, they would sometimes hear something knocking on the rocks where people weren't working. Attempts to find the sources of the noise frequently turned up empty. So what was it? The miners swore they had heard something.
I don't even know what it was, but it had to be a knocker because I'm pretty sure a knocker is a ghost, but they knock on rocks. Do they? Well, there's one thing. I don't even know if they do any harm, so I think they don't do any harm. Because all they do is knock on the rocks.
So you actually covered a couple of different things that I want to talk about. So good job. We're going to keep going, and I think I'm going to answer some of those thoughts. It's here that the legend of the knockers was born. Some stories claim that they're mine fairies, who, depending on their mood, attempt to help or harm the miners. Other versions say that they're ghosts of miners who died on the job and whose spirits couldn't find their way to the afterlife. One version names them as ghosts that are stuck because they weren't good enough for heaven, but they also weren't bad enough for hell. So there you go, there's your ghosts.
Okay.
Before moving on with more information, I'd like to tell a knocker story. Does that sound like a good idea?
Yep.
A man new to Cornwall purchased a house in the mining district. He hadn't lived there for very long before something began waking him up at night. It sounded like something stomping up and down his stairs. Thinking someone was in his house, he'd rush out of his room to catch the intruder, only to find his house empty except for himself. After several nights of this, he finally told his servants about what had been going on. It was then that a maid informed him that it was knockers trying to alert him to a load of tin under the house that needed digging. Doubtful, the man had the area inspected, and sure enough, his property sat on one of the largest tin deposits ever found.
Okay, wait. So, I'm pretty sure that the knocker was trying to, tell him, hey, you need to move your house somewhere else because miners went to probably dig up this piece of tin, and I'm trying to help them, so you better move.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. So they dug that up, and since it was his property, he got really rich.
Okay, I felt like the miners should have gotten rich.
And they did all of the work, but that's beside the point. And that's a totally different debate, and we're not going to touch that. So I'm going to move on to a different topic that's a far less controversial. What do you think the knockers look like?
I think they look like humans that were trying to I think they were humans that were trying to tell the miners that, hey, there's a piece of tin here, I'm just gonna knock on it so that way you know. But the miners couldn't see them, and they were like, aren't you gonna come get it?
Why couldn't the miners see them?
Because they were ghosts.
Okay, that's a fair guess. I've got a description of what they're supposed to look like, and we'll see what you think. From what I could find, they are about 2 feet tall, with thin limbs, so that means really thin arms and legs.
Wow.
And long hooked noses and beards. They sound familiar at all?
It sounds like a wizard that looks like a witch almost.
So like a wizard. Okay, that's a fair guess. I was thinking more along the lines of they look like a dwarf.
Lord of the Rings dwarfs have only normal noses that are just a little big.
Okay, yeah. And it's funny you bring that up because there's definitely some similarity between what we consider a dwarf today and what the descriptions of a knocker is. And Lord of the Rings is certainly a much more modern interpretation. There's some Norse mythology with dwarves and stuff that are totally tied in, but I think the knockers played quite a bit of a part in that description as well. And I should also point out that like modern dwarves, like from Lord of the Rings, knockers can get cranky.
Really?
Yeah, you see, Disney got it all wrong with having the ones in Snow White whistle while they work. Knockers hate them some whistling. If you really want to get on a knocker's bad side, whistle while you work in the mines. They're also not very fond of foul language either. Curse and whistle enough and you might find yourself being tricked into wandering into a cave-in instead of away from one. It's really best to keep them happy by leaving scraps of food and working quietly. Well, as quietly as you can while smashing rocks.
Wait. If they're ghosts, how do they eat the food?
That's a really fair question. I just know that one of the things the miners did to try to keep them happy was they would eat these little hand pies called pasties.
Okay.
And they would save the last little bit of crust and toss it back into the mines for the knockers to eat. But if they're spirits, what are they eating? That's a fair guess. But if they're fairies, I could see where maybe they want to eat it.
But if they look like dwarf ghosts, then I would be creeped out a little. But that's pretty cool because I think they're just trying to help a little.
Well, we'll see. They also really don't like being found. So if you try to go looking for them, you're probably going to make them mad too. So I don't know how helpful they are, especially if they're that cranky. But we'll talk about it some more. How's that?
Okay.
So if you can keep the knockers happy, you're much more likely to stay alive in the mines. One popular story tells of a man who was breaking up rock with a heavy hammer. He was deep in the mine and all alone, but he swore he could hear somebody calling his name before each swing. The shouting got more and more frantic, so he finally decided to find out what was going on. He followed the voice and hadn't gone more than a few feet before a large stone fell from the ceiling and landed right where he had been standing.
Okay, that just sounds like brutality in my way.
Well, but it sounds like the knocker protected him, right?
How?
It got his attention, and it started calling his name, and it made him leave where he was standing. If he had stood there, he would have gotten crushed.
But you said it landed on the space where he was standing.
Had been standing. Big difference.
Oh.
So it definitely pays off to keep the knockers happy. But sometimes, even if you do keep them happy, their warnings aren't always a good thing. There was some belief that hearing them outside of a mine was a sure sign that someone was going to die. I found a story about a night watchman who had heard some strange noises during his shift but couldn't find the source. Within a few days, he fell ill and died. Now, personally, I don't put a whole lot of stock into that story. I mean, there was little linking the noises to him dying. It's almost like me seeing a red car and getting a headache an hour later and then blaming it on seeing the car. And these stories came from a time in history where medical care wasn't exactly the best. So while it's fun to tell old stories, it's always important to be aware of where the stories are coming from. As tin mining began to slowly fall off in Cornwall, many Cornish immigrated to the United States. They easily found work in the mines of the New World, and the knockers came with them. Before long, they were known as Tommy knockers, and the Cornish miners wouldn't work the mines unless proper conditions were met to appease them. Even into the 1900s, miners continued following the traditions of their ancestors from centuries and oceans away. As late as 1956, when a mine in California was due to be closed down, the miners insisted that the owner free the spirits so they could go work somewhere else. And you know what?
He did?
The owner did. The Cornish miners had gained such a reputation for being so good at what they did that everybody went along with their stories about the knockers because it meant that they did their job and they did it well. So when they said, hey, you're going to close this mine, after all of the good work they did, the owner said, okay, we'll let the knockers go. So at this point, you can actually still hear stories about knockers in Colorado. There are still active mines out there, and you can still take tours of mines that have been abandoned. And people report hearing whispers and other noises in the mines that really seem out of place.
Colorado?
Yep.
You mean where my grandma lives?
Your grandma does not live in Colorado.
I meant my Nana.
No, she lives in Illinois.
Oh, Illinois? Really? I thought it was Colorado.
Chicago is not a part of Colorado.
Oh. I was thinking of Chicago. Oh, I thought it was thinking me.
Yes, we have been to Colorado. Yeah. And your Aunt Bev lives in Colorado.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, today, knockers and the belief in them has pretty much faded away. The last tin mine in Cornwall closed down in 1998, so just over 20 years ago. So where they came from, there are no more mines. But, thanks to Stephen King, Tommy knockers remain in people's minds. In 1987, he released a book called The Tommy Knockers. Only in this case, they're aliens instead of spirits. And so the world changes and the knockers with it. The next time you find yourself somewhere deep and dark, though, keep your ears open. And whatever you do, don't whistle.
Or whistle that tune.
Which one?
You know, the ones that the dwarves do.
Oh, whistle while you work?
Yeah, that, like, remember how they do that whistle, like, dun, 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 dun. Like, don't do that, because that will really make them real mad, and yeah.
All right. I think that's going to wrap us up unless you have anything else, Elias.
I do not have anything else.
Actually, I do. I recently came across another podcast that also does some cryptid stuff for kids. So if you check out Unspookable, that's another good one that we recommend. It's very family friendly, and it also gets some kid takes on things as far as what they think cryptids are up to. So check that out if you get a chance.
Well, I think so. What I like the name of Unspookable because it sounds like unspeakable, but they add spook to it.
Right. Well, and Unspookable also sounds like you're not afraid.
Yeah, but I am.
There's no need to be. Anyway, don't forget to visit us on Facebook, Twitter, and Patreon.
Subscribe.
Very much so. Anyway, as always, I'm Sean.
I'm Elias.
Until next time.